All right, the book of Zephaniah means hidden by Yahweh, hidden by the Lord. Not a lot of teachings I could find out there on Zephaniah, so my Bible study just went through it. So I thought I would just share some of the thoughts we found, some things that I thought were interesting. I always like the history. So it's taking place in the reign of King Josiah. And King Josiah was the one who reigned very young, and it's the high priest Hilkiah finds the Torah scroll in the pretty much the kind of the ravaged temple at that point. It hadn't been completely destroyed yet. The destruction of Jerusalem hasn't taken place, but it had been sacked. And they find this scroll and they take it to King Josiah, and he's like, "This is the Torah. This is the Torah of Moses." And it says about Josiah that he turned to the Lord with all his heart, unlike any other king, and that's pretty impressive for the list of kings we have here. They're not so great, but even greater than Solomon or King David, King Saul, that Josiah, he really had that heart that wanted what? To keep the law, keep the Torah, which is the instructions for living. This is why the northern kingdom went away. They got sent into captivity because they weren't obeying. And at this point, they have gone into Assyrian captivity. So King Josiah, let's see, at the age of, what is it? Is it 18th year of reign, he has a second cleansing, and his first cleansing he happened, let's see, so in his 12th year of reign, and that'd be 632, he purges Judah of evil, and he even goes into Ephraim, which would have been the northern kingdom. At that point, there would have been just Assyrians that had been planted there to kind of take up and live, and we find some stories about that they didn't fare so well, that they actually had to have Levites come and teach them how to honor Yahweh as well. They didn't give up their other gods, but that's nothing new for the northern kingdom. They were already partaking in such things and mixing. They had their temple on Mount Gerizim that Jeroboam set up, and said that they shouldn't go down to Jerusalem anymore. This is kind of going against the law as well, because there's 3 feasts that they were supposed to pilgrimage to Jerusalem for, and you weren't supposed to set up another temple. And even later we see in Josephus, historical Josephus, he talks about that temple renaming itself during the story of Hanukkah, essentially, when Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth comes down into the land and just trying to enforce, Greek belief, and anyone that kept the Torah would be pretty much persecuted and killed and tortured until they wouldn't. Even like if you were circumcised, they would kill the child. They would hang it from the mother's neck. So like people are having these like secret circumcision. Reminds me of like the movie Braveheart, where they had to get like married in secret. It's just that kind of stuff going on. So they were like, oh, we're just Arabs. We're not Jews. Which is probably like a half truth, because they would also be like, oh, we're Jewish when, or not Jewish, but Israeli, because not all Israelites are Jews, and not all Jews are, well, all Jews are Israelites, but not all Israelites are Jews, because they're from the tribe of Judah, Judeans. And they renamed that temple Jupiter Hellenus, I believe, just to even further mark it as something that was against Yahweh. So Josiah does a good job. So not only is he tearing down the high places, because they believed, gods would dwell on these mountaintops, on these high hills, and they would go up and they would put idols under their trees and go worship there. So he would tear them down, tear down these poles, the Asherah poles and all that, and the Baal, and Baal and Asherah just like husband and wife, as far as like the Utteric Baal cycle, where a lot of this idea comes from. he did a good job at destroying that. His death is a little confusing. Kind of like he gets into this fight with Egypt. They didn't really have to, and still dies pretty early. I think he was only around 30 years old. But still, to be called that he turned to Yahweh with unlike any other king, that's definitely something to be noted. But then we have Zephaniah. Like, why is he preaching? Probably during one of the reigns of the most, this reminds me a lot of like the Maccabees, like they really were trying to turn things around. They started chasing out any idolatry, and really just on fire for keeping the Torah and also having it in their hearts. But still we see Zephaniah kind of pronouncing some judgment here. Why is he speaking that? So we'll look at just a little bit here. Really short book. We probably could read it, but I don't want to read it again. So it's possible that Hezekiah here is in fact the King Hezekiah. It would have been, I think, Josiah's great-great-grandfather, but possible also that Zephaniah has some royalty in him. And interesting, like chapter 1 is a bit like the reverse of Genesis 1, where it's talking about creation, and then like everything's getting destroyed. And he's kind of prophesying beyond what we see as far as the destruction of Jerusalem, even though it was bad by Babylonians, but not as vast as we see here. And I think with a lot of these minor prophets, they kind of parallel to Revelation, where we have kind of these parallels for the end times, because they're always giving pictures of what it's going to be like when the Messiah finally comes, because that's the whole goal, is him reigning as king. Losing my voice. As we enter into covenant, and then the Messiah comes down and reigns as king. That's the whole goal. So they're always giving a glimpse of what that future Messianic kingdom will actually look like. And that's the cool thing about a lot of the minor prophets here, is they're talking about, hey, there's judgment against Jerusalem, and then there's judgment against the nations as well. But the theme is always harsher judgment towards who? Those who are in covenant. And that's what I kind of like about Nahum. It's another minor prophet we just rolled through. Probably could have done a video on that one, because again, there's not that much out there. And if you read the book of Jonah, it's a great story. I didn't like it for a while. It's just strange that this prophet, because no prophet was sent outside Israel. So it's just strange right off the bat that he is being told to go, prophesy to the enemy, not just like another nation, but the enemy of the northern kingdom at that point. Judah had some sort of shaky relationship with Assyria. But, and in fact, that was kind of Israel's own fault. Kind of forced Judah to align with Assyria, because the northern kingdom aligned with Syria. Not Assyria, but Syria. To fight against them. So Assyria came and conquered the northern kingdom. Took them a while, but they did. But before that happens, we have Jonah. And he comes and he preaches to Nineveh, and they turn around. And when you turn around, that's great. But at the same time, when you do that, it's the same as accepting, God. You're coming into covenant relationship with him. You're supposed to do the things. And that is just like what Josiah found out, the scroll in the temple. Keep the Torah. They didn't. And they were given a timetable. And by my math, it was about 148 years, which is approximately 3 jubilees. 3 50-year cycles. Given the chance to, okay, you repented, but let's see if you're actually living correctly. Because it needs to be in your heart, too. And that can't just be out of fear. Like, oh, I better better turn to God, or I don't want to die. I don't want to go to hell. I don't want to face judgment. Not that all judgment is bad, but the judgment you read about here is always not good. It's destruction. So we see that Assyria, if we contrast it with like Babylon, judged much harsher than Babylon. If you read Nahum, you can just see how that's detailed. Pretty severely punished. And we get some of the same themes here in Zephaniah about Israel. Or Babylon, when they were conquered by the Medo-Persia, Belshazzar was killed, but mostly it was a non-conflict takeover. And even Vashti was, I think, Belshazzar's daughter, ends up marrying Ahasuerus, which could have been Xerxes or Artaxerxes. I'm still trying to figure that one out. Most people say Xerxes. There's even a strange theory that Xerxes, after his failed invasion into Greece, he changed his name to Artaxerxes and then married Esther. It's very interesting, but let's move on to Zephaniah. So, chapter 1, and we even have, let's see here, I'll look at it because I got my Bible here, but it's the Sefer, which gives me some weird words, so I'm going to contrast that with the King James. So let's look up. It's talking about Baal here in verse 4, and the Camarines. These were these priests. And that word doesn't appear much in the Old Testament, but they were essentially the priests of Baal. And they had strange apparel. So we'll get to that later. We'll look at Matthew 22, because that's talking about the wedding, and having the garments. So what is he doing? He's stretching his house upon Judah and all the inhabitants, and will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the name of the Camarines, the priests. And Malcolm here might be Molech. So it's possible they were sacrificing to Moloch, which is child sacrifice usually. and I get that for sure. It's strange how a society can get to that point where killing a child is okay, and today it's almost, you could see the same kind of justification with abortion and all like that. It's like they're making a case, and it's like almost like commonplace. But right now there's a war on it, so it's good. But you could see how people could justify these things. And for them, it was we have to do these things. It was almost like an honor to give up your child because it was for the betterment of society, and the rains would continue to come and the crops would continue to grow. That was the whole point of worshiping the Baals. And they didn't see that same reward with Yahweh. And I think the big point there is like, why? It's like I give to Yahweh, but I don't feel like I get back. I feel like things get kind of worse for me. And that's the strange thing about blessing, because blessing from Yahweh doesn't always come in the form of crops and wealth and riches. It comes in the form, and I like to say it comes in the form of the fruit of the Spirit. You get these blessings as far as wisdom and knowledge and understanding. And usually the way he gives you those is to, he keeps you relying on him by consistent trials and growth. Doesn't want you to become stagnant. If you're stagnant, you're prone to infection. So he's trying to grow you. He's trying to make you a better believer. And blessings will come, not always in material ways, but in the fruits of the Spirit. And I like to say the same thing for Solomon. He asked for wisdom. And God's like, well, here's 700 women. Because if you can manage that household, then having and dealing with the surrounding nations will be a walk in the park. Not saying you should marry 700 women, but just an example. Alright, so yeah, in 8 we have this strange apparel. Punish the princes and the king's children and all such as are clothed with strange apparel. It could have to do with how these priests were dressed, but it is interesting to kind of tie this into Matthew 22. We look at the wedding guests. So let's just read this together. So forgive me, this is in the Complete Jewish Bible. So Yeshua again used parables and speaking to them. The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding feast for his son. But when he sent his slaves to summon the invited guests to the wedding, they refused to come. So he sent more slaves, instructing them to tell the guests, "Look, I've prepared my banquet. I've slaughtered my bulls and my fattened calves, fattened cattle, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding." But they weren't interested and went off, one to his farm and another to his business. And the rest grabbed his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. This is speaking of the prophets. As far as I know, Zephaniah wasn't mistreated and killed, but because he was actually preaching during, a godly king. But Josiah's father or grandfather was Manasseh, who supposedly had sawn Isaiah in half with a wooden saw. So many of the prophets were, in fact, being killed. So those are the slaves that are being sent. So it's kind of reference here to Zephaniah. Mistreated them and killed them. And the king was furious and sent his soldiers, who killed those murderers and burned down their city. So this might even be a reference here to Jerusalem being burned down. He sent Babylon, right? He sent Babylon to do his bidding. And if we read the Apocalypse of Baruch, kind of gives us a little bit of a different picture that God offered up Jerusalem as a sacrifice. He didn't want the Babylonians to think that they had conquered it out of their own might, but he actually had the walls fall. It actually talks about the Ark of the Covenant being swallowed by the earth too, which is interesting if you are into that Indiana Jones kind of stuff. But the idea there being God offered it. Babylon didn't conquer Jerusalem. God did. Did it on purpose. So then he said to his slaves, "Well, the wedding feast is ready, but the ones who were invited didn't deserve it. So go out to the street corners and invite to the banquet as many as you find." The slaves went out into the streets, gathered all the people they could find, bad along with the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. Now when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there was a man who wasn't dressed for a wedding. So he asked him, "Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?" And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, "Bind him hand and foot, throw him outside in the dark. In that place people will wail and grind their teeth, for many are invited, but few are chosen." So, just like Josiah, keeping the Torah, keeping the law, keeping yourself set apart, and not only that, but having the heart for it. And I think part of the heart is understanding what the blessing is, that you're not going to get riches and everything out of this. You're going to get knowledge and understanding, and you're going to understand your Creator better. So you must have the heart as well. If your heart is not in it, the judgment will come. And the day of the Lord is something that kind of reappears here, and just like in Revelation, with this wrath or judgment coming. And we see a little bit of a picture with the destruction of Jerusalem there. And it's kind of like the question we get with the minor prophets, especially as we move on to like another book like Zechariah, which takes place after. So we have the destruction, and then they come back under Zerubbabel. It's like, now, of course, the Messianic kingdom is going to come. It's going to come. And a lot of us don't realize that we're waiting on God, but God's actually waiting on us. And it's And Jews have this idea that if every Jew would just keep the Sabbath, that he would come automatically. And I don't necessarily agree with that, but like the premise is there is like if we just start following his rules, start seeking after his heart, that's when he's going to come. And I think that he's given us multiple chances. And I think with the story of Hanukkah, which is actually coming up now, it's not just about lighting the candles. It was a very tough time, and I think that these people showed resolve to follow the law and fight. Many didn't, and many were wiped out. And I think they lost their way, of course. We have the whole Hasmonean kingdom being set up at that point for almost 200 years, which is what Herod the Great married into. And then we see Jesus come on the scene. And I think he comes on the scene because they showed some preparedness. They showed that they had the garments on. They just weren't quite ready. And that's why he's going to come again, because we weren't ready. And that's the question we're going to ask. It's like, if we were ready, would he have set up the kingdom right then? It depends how Calvinistic you want to be with it. But I think we kind of think of it that way. It's sometimes we think like, oh, that had to happen. Like Judas had to betray him. It's like, interesting, very interesting. We have the whole story of redeeming the bride. Jesus had to come and die. And that's something I still struggle with. Because yes, we needed a redeemer, of course. But he could have offered that simply as taking on his role as our high priest, which he has in the heavenly temple. But also, I understand that whether we are divorced from God, we broke the covenant and divorced ourselves, or we were divorced from the land, as some believe, they run into this same issue that we needed redemption. But I still like to think that the kingdom could have been set up if we were simply ready. And that's kind of the question Zechariah asks, and also Zephaniah here. Let's see if I have anything else marked here. I really like chapter 2, so let's go there. Right off the bat here. Gather yourselves together, ye gathered together. Gather yourselves together, ye gathered together, O nation not desired. I did read that correctly. It was just so old Englishy. Before the decree, bring forth, before the day pass as the chaff, before the fierce anger of the Lord come upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger come upon you. Seek ye the Lord, all ye meek of the earth. So, some humbleness. Not a lot of humility was had at the time of Jesus. A lot of that came out of the Hasmonean kingdom, especially because they were Levites who were holding the kingship and the priesthood. They should have had the priesthood, but some people debate whether that was the line of Zadok, which it should have been, or if it was the Maccabees themselves. Obviously Judah and a lot of his brothers died, but some of the younger brothers did continue on. It stayed in that line, so they remained as kings, even though they were Levites. So, as Jacob's promises were, scepter should have remained in the house of Judah, not Levi. And the priesthood belonged to the line of Zadok. So the fact that they didn't hand those over, it might have been out of a pride issue that all of Judah has failed. 1,000 years of the kingdom of Israel just failing because of these kings that just weren't obeying. So you can understand why Levi would want to take control. and of passion. They were a passionate brother. You remember Phinehas was a Levite. He's the guy with the spear, just that Yahweh honored because of his passion, but Levi was not meant to rule, and so there might have been a little pride there. So humility. Definitely see pride with the Pharisees as well. Which have wrought this judgment, seek righteousness. Righteousness is the robes we put on, so the good, clean garments. When we go to the wedding, and a lot of people consider New Jerusalem the bride. So when we see New Jerusalem, this is where the wedding feast will take place, or Yeshua will be in New Jerusalem, and we'll be there as guests. And to be a part of that, we need to be righteous. We need to have been keeping Torah to the best of our ability in our hearts as well. And that's the most important part. We need to seek holiness. So seek meekness, seek holiness, and it shall be hid in the day of the Lord's anger. So I hear a lot of people say they believe in the preacher rapture because how could the Lord's anger and wrath, punishment, fall on us? It doesn't sound like they've really read the minor prophets, because there's some very harsh judgment. Judgment first to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, I wouldn't consider just the Jews. It's anyone who's come into covenant with Yahweh is who I would consider Jerusalem. And the harlot in Revelation, I believe, is also Jerusalem. Many people point to Rome. And maybe you could say that. Maybe Constantine and what he did formed some sort of covenant. Shy away from that thought. But at the same time, somehow Nineveh came into covenant too. So I guess it's not that far-fetched, but Rome is just part of the covenant people. That's kind of where the Catholic Church came out of, because after Jesus, we had the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and Jews slowly getting pushed out of that land. With 130, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, they were kind of scattered. Not just the Jews, but what went with them was a lot of the believers in Messiah, who would have looked very similar to Jews. So Constantine has all these edicts that he puts out against the Jewish festivals and everything. So it would have been really confusing for a lot of these early Christians who would have been doing all the Jewish things as well. Well, they're not Jewish things, they're what Josiah discovered, which is the Torah, God's commandments and his law that they were supposed to be doing. And then all of a sudden being told they can't do these things. And that created confusion for a good 2,000 years, bringing us to today where we're still super confused on what is holy living? How are we supposed to be living? And just keeping the Torah isn't holy living either, especially today in Judaism, because it's become so manufactured and twisted, and that they've added so much to it that it's almost not recognizable anymore. It's like you almost have to clear your mind of it and just grab a Bible and start reading it for yourself. So I like that verse 3 there. You'll be hidden the day of the Lord. So we will be hidden. So people think that New Jerusalem will come before the millennial reign, and that's where we'll be hidden, or the other places will be hidden from the wrath. Not just going to heaven. I don't really believe that anyone goes to heaven, because we're meant to be here, and we're meant to go through some trials. Yes, we'll be there for the wrath, but we're not going to be part of it. Just like Lot was pulled out of the city. But, if you turn around and you look, then you might face wrath, just like his wife did. So we might be appointed to wrath if we're not. If our heart's not in the right place, and if we don't have those garments of righteousness. And there's a lot more you could go here with this whole book. There's a lot of interesting things. I wrote here, it's not your religion, but it's your covenant relationship that matters. So it's like people say, oh, who is the whore of Babylon? Is it the Catholics? Is it Judaism? Is it those Christians? Is it those weird Messianics? I think there's believers in all of those. There's no religion and there's no title that's going to save you. It's your covenant relationship. It's your personal relationship with Yahweh that matters. It's not whatever title you claim. All right. And again, we see this book, Jerusalem referred to as a her, being a picture of the harlot as well, and New Jerusalem is a picture of, since the land was divorced, and we were divorced from the land, the way you want to think about it, then a new land is required. So the destruction we see in chapter 1, kind of like laying waste to Old Jerusalem, so New Jerusalem can come down. It's clearing the land away. And we see that theme in a couple of the other prophets as well. Chapter 3, 11. It talks about the holy mountain. In that day shalt thou not be ashamed for all thy doings, therein thou hast transgressed against me, for then I will take away out of the midst of thee them that rejoiced in thy pride, and thou shalt no more be haughty because of my holy mountain. And we have the holy mountain being the picture in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where you had this statue being kind of these empires throughout time. And then the mountain comes down, or the boulder comes down and crushes it, and the mountain comes up. And I think that's a picture of New Jerusalem being this holy mountain. And if you take the measurements that we have in the Bible for what New Jerusalem would look like, it'll be almost halfway to the moon, which is pretty crazy. Pretty tall. Pretty big base. Alright, let's see if we got anything else. Little thoughts on Zephaniah here. Of course, we always got our good bit at the end here. Turning to the land, promise of New Jerusalem. But first the trials have to come. And we're always looking at the nations, like, when are the nations going to get judged? They'll get theirs. But what does God care about? He cares about your relationship with Him. That's why He's waiting. The destruction of the nations will come when we stop holding on to these things and just start working on our relationship with Him. A lot of us are sitting back, just waiting like Jonah did for the destruction of Nineveh. I think we can all relate to Jonah. So the remnant, prepared, were bidden to be guests of the king, but needed to be wearing the wedding garments, lest they be destroyed and burned up in the city/land. So Zephaniah 1:4-18, if you want to read through that again. All those words can be kind of found paralleling what we read in Matthew 22. And then another cool thing is the destruction, kind of undoing creation in chapter 1. And study up on Josiah, 2 Chronicles 34. You can read a little bit about him. Jeremiah 15:4. Jeremiah was also a contemporary of Zephaniah. They probably lived at the same time. Jeremiah lived for a couple kings, but 1 Kings 13. We have the prophecy against the northern kingdom. And then that might have been fulfilled by Josiah going up there to tear down those high places. So just some verses I wrote down there. that you could look up, and hopefully this made your wheels turn. It's a quick book. It's easy to go fly through without really thinking about it in context. And I hope you liked that little bit from Matthew there.